All right, Jesse Brown's Outdoors trying to shed some light on the mysteries of fly fishing, and I tell you what, there are plenty of them and a lot of confusion out there on that.
You know, Don, anytime I feel like I know a little bit more about fly fishing, I listen to you and Dave talk, or you and really any of our customers talk, and I realize there is so much about fly fishing that I don't have a good grasp on. I know one of the questions a lot of our customers have is what line do I use for what application? And then what leader and tippet do I use?
Well, it's a big mystery, and the wonderful thing about fly fishing is that the longer you do it, the more you learn because the more you can learn.
Mm-hmm.
And like everything else, you have to learn it one step at a time. And that's a good basic question. What line do you use? Typically for trout fishing in North Carolina, we're going to be using a weight forward floating line. Have seldom, if ever, used any other type of line, a sinking line, an intermediate line, anything else for trout fishing in North Carolina. Now, if we're going bass fishing, the answer again still tends to be a weight forward floating line, but I do occasionally use some sinking lines where I need to fish for the fish that are probably more than 5 or 6 feet deep. Sinking line literally is what it sounds like. It's got a part of the line that is literally lead core and sinks at a specific rate. So there's like a type 2, type 3, type 4, type 5. The higher the number, the faster it sinks. Think of it as inches per second. Think of it as a countdown lure. It hits the water, you count to 6, it's going down probably, in the case of a type 6, 6 inches per second, you've counted to 6, it's down 3 feet. Now you start stripping or bringing the line in to swim the minnow and attract the fish, it stays at that level. So no fish, count to 9, so on and so forth. Intermediate lines tend to sink just below the surface and stay there. Now they are quite useful in saltwater in that the wind and the waves don't interfere with them. They fish much like a floating line in that they are up in the top of the water column, but the wind and waves don't mess with them. Also, sinking lines can be very useful in saltwater when you've got to get down deeper. But again, the go-to is going to be a weight forward floating line 9 times out of 10, regardless of what you're doing.
Now, most of our customers at Jesse Brown's and most of the listeners to the Carolina Outdoor Show are fishing primarily in North Carolina, South Carolina. In the freshwater application, if I'm going to a trout stream, I'm probably in a 4 or 5 weight
That's
range.
correct. And that's based on the actual physical weight of the first 30 feet of the fly line. The lighter the line, the more fun it is to catch the fish. So you don't need a big heavy line, 7, 8 weight like that in freshwater for trout. You may for bass because the heavier lines will cast better in the wind and carry bigger flies with them. But in trout fishing, we're looking for more finesse, so 3, 4s, and 5s are the answer. But if you go to the coast, we're automatically going to an 8 weight or larger.
Now, what about, we'll come back to the coast in just a minute. A couple times a year, we have a rush of folks who are heading out west, somewhere in the Rocky Mountain area to go trout fishing.
Right.
What kind of line are we using out there?
Again, weight forward floating, but in 5s and 6s. Not only the line, but the rod needs to be a 5 or 6 because you're dealing with longer cast and you're dealing with wind because of the lack of trees and things out there. So a lot more wide open, a lot bigger streams, and 5s and 6s are certainly going to cast better than a 4 or a 5, 3 or a 4 out there.
Sure.
That's for sure. So you know, it's kind of like picking out a truck to do the job. You want one big enough to haul what you've got, but you don't want it so big that it's no longer fun to operate.
Right. Now, this time of year, so we're recording right now in mid-March. Earlier in the winter, we had our typical excitement and rush for people going down to the Bahamas for bonefish, maybe a little tarpon, maybe some early permit action. What are we using for that?
Well, 8s and 10s tend to be the answer there. 8 weight because that will cast, you know, small flies, great distances for bonefish. And one thing that's really key there is the fact that the water is warm. So tropical lines, warm places, tend to be very wiry and very stiff. And they also need to be stretched every morning to get some of that coil out of them because they got a lot of memory from being on that reel for a year. So you want to stretch that line, and it's a very stiff line so it doesn't get overly soft in that warm water. If you took a cold water line, for example, like a trout fishing line, and went to the Bahamas with it, even if it was an 8 weight, it would be very gummy and wouldn't cast very well. It would tend to cling to the rod and to the guides and so forth. So it's important to have the right water temperature line as well. And sometimes it gets a little confusing, like with redfish. You know, we have summer redfish lines and winter redfish lines based on water temperature. Again, the summer line is going to be wiry and stiff.
So once I've got that right line on the reel, then I've got to worry about leader and tippet. Walk us through selecting the right leader and tippet.
Well, in trout, we tend to use a fairly soft, supple leader and tippet. Leader tends to be 7.5 or 9 feet for trout, 7.5 feet in our small streams, 9 feet for out west and for our tail races over in Tennessee. Tippet or tip into the leader is made into that and referred to in X values, 5X, 6X, 7X, so forth. 5X kind of being the general all-round size. Now that's an old British wire size gauge, which is very confusing. If you subtract the 5X from 11, you're left with 6. It's 6/1000ths of an inch in diameter. That'd be a lot easier to just call it by what it is, isn't it?
I was told there'd be no math involved here, Don.
The bigger the number, the littler it is, okay? The littler it is, the harder it is for the fish to see it, and the easier it is to break the fish off. So 5X is a nice all-round size. If the water's low and clear, yes, we'll go to 6X. However, 5X happens to be 5-pound strongs this day and age, and that's a real advantage because it's improved greatly over the last 50 years. Now, when we go to salt water, we're typically in the Bahamas going to fish 8 or 10-pound leaders for bonefish. Now, those bonefish leaders tend to be quite stiff and hard because if they run into a mangrove root or coral or a seashell, they don't cut off as easy. So those also make very good bass leaders because of that, because they're a hard monofilament.
Yep.
And they'll cut weeds. So typically, and in that case, we refer to them by pounds of strength of the tippet as opposed to diameter. But typically 8 and 10 pound, 9 and 10 foot leaders for bonefish. Permit, we jump right up to 16 pounds, okay? Tarpon, a whole nother ball game because now we've got a very complex leader that has what we call shock tippet or bite tippet on the front of it, which is big, like 80 or 100 pound. And the reason is those fish have very abrasive faces. Their face feels just like a sandpaper. And they can wear through your typical class tippet or breakable tippet that's between it and the fly line, which is typically 20 pound in that case. So you have 20 pound class tippet, you have a 80 or 100 pound shock tippet, and those things are very complex, and by far the best thing to do is buy those pre-made so you're ready to go. And on that, we're typically going to be using a 10 weight rod in the Bahamas. If we're in Florida, we're jumping up to a 12 weight. The bonefish the tarpon are much bigger in Florida than they are in Bahamas.
Sure. You know, there's so many things that we can buy online, but we can't easily tap into someone's knowledge on these things, which is why it's great that at a store like Jesse Brown's, we have folks like you and Dave and Bill who can answer those questions and get people outfitted before those trips. But with all this line, leader, and tippet, there's a lot of knots involved. And, you know, I always am quick to admit that there are certain tips and tricks I like to rely on, but one that doesn't work in rock climbing or in fishing is if you can't tie a knot, tie a lot. So what are a couple of knots we can keep in our mind?
A triple granny knot is not a solution.
No, it's not.
No,
So
triple grannies are out.
What are 1 or 2 knots that we should really have a good mastery of?
In trout fishing, it's very simple. There are really only 2 knots you need. You need a knot to add tippet back to your leader, and we use a triple surgeon's knot, which is by far the easiest, or a blood knot. Now, a blood knot is a little bit stronger, but it's much more difficult to tie. You can find those on YouTube, a blood knot or a triple surgeon's knot. Now, many things will tell you to tie a double surgeon's knot, but if you go through the 3rd time making it a triple, it's 10% stronger. So I like the triple surgeon's knot. So that's how I add tippet to my leader. Now, the only other thing I've got to do is tie on my fly. And for years, we used the improved clinch knot or fisherman's knot. However, it is only 65% of the strength of the leader or tippet. I have switched to a new knot, relatively new, about 5-6 years old, called the Eugene Bend, like the 2 towns in Oregon, Eugene and Bend, Oregon. If you look that one up on YouTube, it's no harder to tie than an improved clinch knot, and it is 100% the strength of that tippet. Now, recently on Facebook, Field and Stream put out a list of the 10 best fisherman's knots, and they did not include that one, so they don't even know about it yet. By far the best knot. It has saved me a fortune in flies. The Eugene Bend knot. Now, that's all you need for trout or bass. Now, when we get to the ocean, we start tying loop knots instead of a Eugene Bend knot so that the fly can move a little more freely. And when we get to tarpon, we now tie the fly on with a, if it's 80-pound, 2.5 turn clinch knot. If it's 100-pound, it's a 1.5 turn clinch knot. And those are more specialized, and we'll be glad to help you out with those and show you those. But they are simple knots, but they are very different than what you would normally tie based on the diameters of the material you're using.
That's really good to know. Now, Don, how long have you been guiding fly fishing?
25 years.
So in 25 years, the gear has probably changed a little bit. One of the pieces of equipment that we really spend some time on here for fly fishing and for really anything else outside is sunglasses. And
Right.
just the other day, I did a YouTube or a Facebook Live on sunglasses. And we talked about the brands we carry here at Jesse Brown's, SunCloud, Maui Jim, and Costa Del Mar. Real quick, kind of give us an intro of why we want polarized lenses, but then also, is there a tint or a coating that you prefer?
Polarized lenses are an absolute must. What polarization does is it cuts down on the glare of the water, and you are able to see the fish much better. Fish are hard to see even at that, but if you can see that fish and see if your flies are relatively close to that fish, you're going to start to improve your success. Over and over and over guiding, I will take off my pair of Costas and I'll hand them to the customer and say, look through these, and they go, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was that much difference. But there are a lot of different tints and things that are made to specialize for various types of water. And for North Carolina, for our trout streams, which tend to be relatively shady and relatively poorly lit because of all the vegetation and the fact that the mountains are steep and all, I prefer a brown lens, brown or even copper. Now, for example, in Costa Del Mar, they make a green mirror finish with a brown lens, which is the one I prefer myself and I use, and people are quite amazed what they can see through that one compared to their normal Ray-Bans or whatever they may have on. But even the SunClouds, they come up with a brown lens that works very, very well. Same thing with Maui Jims. Browns and coppers for low light conditions will help you to find that fish, and seeing that fish is a huge advantage. When I go to open water bass fishing, or especially on the Bahama bonefish flats, I'm going to a gray tint. The darker the gray, the better on bright things like bonefish flats.
Sure.
Costa Del Mar makes a blue mirror with a gray tint that is just awesome for that. Really helps you a great deal to see those bonefish. Bonefish are impossible to see. The first day you go fishing, you won't see a fish. The second day, everything you see will be a fish, and by the third day, you'll start to see some fish. But the guides are remarkable because they're used to looking for them. But if you look at those guys, they may not even have a decent t-shirt, but they got a good pair of sunglasses, because that is the most important piece of equipment they have. So seeing fish is a huge advantage. Otherwise, you are literally shooting in the dark.
When protects your eyes, but then working front to back on that. In our tree canopy here, we want something that's going to still be polarized, that's going to let in more light but reduce the glare. And we get to more open water, we want to let in less light, still reduce the glare, but really increase contrast again, so we can tell, is that a fish?
That's right.
Or is it a shadow?
Contrast is very important, and the quality of the lens is very important. I mean, people go, is there really is a $200 sunglass really worth it? Well,
Yes.
Let me tell you, if you are really spending a lot of money on a fishing trip, you bet it's worth it. It's worth every penny of it, because it does increase that contrast, and that gives you sharper edges, which allows you to see that bottom line on a fish, those fins underneath. Many times you don't see the fish, you just see the bottom line under the fish, or you see the shadow of the fish, or you see a little movement of the tail. It's all about the details. It's like deer hunting. You don't walk out there and see a whole deer. You see the flicker of an ear, the twitch of a tail. You see legs that are straight in among brambles and branches. You've got to look for parts and pieces, and you've got to look hard, or you're not going to be successful.
It's obvious that this is the Carolina Outdoor Show because we went from talking about fly fishing to deer hunting all in one segment. We've just thrown a lot of information out there to you. Thanks for checking in. You can check out the Carolina Outdoors podcast wherever you get your podcasts and up and down the East Coast and all over the world except for North Korea, parts of China. Isn't that what Bill always tells us?
That's what Bill says, but I think China might open up here.
We'll wait and see. Y'all be good and we'll talk to you soon.